So what I'm going to talk today about, use the Toronto Star article that appeared in February to talk about, I think, some of the issues we've been talking about today. How is information presented in the media? How do people understand complex issues? And what is the role of healthcare providers or professionals that work with vaccine to help their patients, the public, navigate that? So I don't know if anyone who around here read this article. We have some people, so some of you will remember it. So it appeared on the front page of the Star, and it was tagged as a Star investigation. And so if you looked at the headline, it was a pretty scary headline, right? A wonder drug's dark side. And then the caveat underneath it was said, even though hundreds of thousands of teen girls have safely taken it, the but was big. But the Star has found something. 60 Canadians have experienced debilitating illness after taking it. And there's not a full disclosure of risk. So that subline basically tells you what the story and what the feel of the article was. So what the Star did in this investigation is they talked about 5 stories of young women. And they were young women who had illnesses or sicknesses after having had the Gardasil vaccine. The woman on the left, her daughter died 2 weeks after having the Gardasil vaccine. She was found drowned in her bathtub. The young girl in the middle had debilitating illness, was a dancer, and then after the Gardasil vaccine was in wheelchair. The one in the bottom, she had a heart attack, she was in a coma, she's on a feeding tube. And they go through all of these stories that are heart-wrenching. And who's not going to read that and feel emotion and also start to wonder, what is this vaccine? Is it safe? Besides the 5 stories, they also talked about reports associated with the Gardasil vaccine. And this is where my talk will talk to you about understanding what it means when it's printed in here. So 60 reports means we have a way of monitoring vaccine incidents, and anything that happens after a vaccine can be reported. What's important, and what I hope you understand by the end of this presentation, is because it's reported and it follows the vaccine, in no way shows that it's causal or that the vaccine caused these problems. All of these young girls had illnesses that happened to them. They all happened after the Gardasil vaccine, but whether or not the vaccine caused it, that requires further investigation, and there's no suggestion that it actually has. So because the investigation was done in what could be considered a biased way, or didn't report the information in a way that the public could really understand what the information meant. It was scary, it was sensational, and it really didn't balance it with everything we know about Gardasil. So the response from healthcare professionals was quick and fast. So Jen Gunter, I don't know if that's how you say it, but that's how we're going to say it. She's an obstetrician, and she immediately, on her blog, February 5th, wrote a very extensive response. And in it, she talked about she miscarried one of her triplets and had Jamba Juice just before. Did the Jamba Juice cause the miscarriage? No. And talked about linkages in time do not mean causal relationship, and then really talked about how safe the vaccine is. And she did an interview on CBC As It Happens, and she talked about what she thought this article, it's the equivalent of Jenny McCarthy. And in Ellen's presentation, she talked about Jenny McCarthy and how much she was given voice about her opinion of autism and how much damage that's done. February 9th, there's a British epidemiologist and author gets involved on Twitter because some of the columnists used his work to defend what they had done. And if you know him, he's written articles about how do we know science is good and how do we know pharma is reporting what they should. So there's a long Twitter trail, but he basically says this is irresponsible journalism. You have a forum, you have to be responsible in what you report, and you have to help the public essentially understand what you're doing. And then there was an opinion or a commentary or a letter to the editor that really was the response to the article. And Mark Loeb was one of the signatories, and 63 others. I don't check email enough, so I was too late to sign on to that. But they really talked about there is no dark side to HPV. It's a safe vaccine, and they went through and tried to help people understand what was in the article and why the article was misleading, and also, again, raise the issue of what's the ethics of reporting. As a big newspaper, you have an ethical responsibility to ensure that what you're reporting is factual, and your job is to help people understand what the risks are and benefits in a balanced way. So a lot of what we're talking about is the STAR focused on anecdotes. And so anecdotes are really, they're stories. They're not really evidence. They can point to something, but they don't conclusively tell you anything. The problem with the stories in this article is they were very compelling, because who's not going to read an article about a young woman who gets sick and feel for that young woman? But it doesn't mean that it's the cause. And so it was very misleading. And so how do we in medicine, because we talked in some of the other presentations, how do you deal with these stories that are sensational but don't really present the whole picture? And that's really about getting people to understand what is it they're saying. They're telling you a story. If your best friend tells you she went to McDonald's and got sick, it doesn't mean McDonald's is always going to cause people to get sick. Your best friend maybe got sick and it was unrelated. But in everyday life, we have to have a mindset about what do stories mean. They can point to something, but they don't always. So I think some of us have talked about causation, correlation. What does that mean? So anecdotes do not prove causation. So just because you had the Gardasil vaccine and then you got sick, that does not mean the Gardasil vaccine caused your sickness. Just because one thing followed another doesn't mean that. I think we would all know if someone won the lottery after getting the vaccine, that the vaccine didn't cause them to win the lottery. That's obvious. In medicine, it's not so obvious. So if someone says, I ended up in a wheelchair after I had the vaccine, people start to question, well, is it possible? And so what we have to do is do assessments of that and make people, or help people to understand what does it mean. And so this is where there can be, like the thalidomide you mentioned, right? Thalidomide, when did they figure out it was a problem? When it was in the market, and then people started to have stories or problems of cause. So there is a role in anecdote in terms of showing a pattern, but even then it has to be investigated and determined, is it truly causal or is it just a coincidence? And so we have a term, post-marketing surveillance of vaccines. We recognize no vaccine is perfect and trials are small. They're done in a select population. When you have something then in millions of people, very, very, very rare occurrences may happen, and you won't pick that up unless you continue to monitor that. And so that's really what post-marketing surveillance allows us to do, to identify, are there maybe things happening with the vaccine that weren't identified in this trial, so that we can be confident on an ongoing basis when we recommend a vaccine that we know it to be safe. Not just from what happened in the trial, but what's happening as it's being marketed in an ongoing way. And so this is where it's very important to understand that in Canada, US, all countries, there's an obligation to report events that happen after someone is vaccinated. The reporting in and of itself does not imply that they think it's caused. It's identifying this happened. It doesn't mean it's causal, which is what wasn't clear, I don't think, in that article. So because 60 people reported events after Gardasil, that just is a collection of stories. It doesn't mean there's any way that it was causal. You have to figure out and analyze each of those reports to see what is the association. And to make it understandable in a local term, at the public health unit, I'm responsible for looking at all of these reports that come into Hamilton. So any physician who administers a vaccine, any pharmacist who administers a vaccine, any parent who thinks a vaccine has caused something in their child, if a drug company becomes aware of a report, they have to funnel in through a system. In Ontario, that's through local public health. So I receive, we call them adverse events after immunization. So I receive all those reports. And so I look at the report to say, and they usually fall in a couple categories, like if there's some known things. You can get a rash after the measles vaccine. So yes, actually, that was causal, but it's not an event that has bad consequences for the person. Or I'll get reports that this person fainted after having the vaccine. Well, the vaccine probably didn't cause them to faint. They fainted because they don't like needles, right? So it's things like that that come in. And then there's some times where they broke out in hives. It's a potential allergic reaction. So there's a process in most countries, and in Ontario it goes through local public health, where we receive reports. The reports are received and we pass them up the chain that goes into the Public Health Agency of Canada, and the reports look for patterns. And then for more complicated stuff, they look to see, is it determined? But accepting the report doesn't mean that we think it's causal. It's part of the process to ensure we're not missing anything that could be happening with the vaccine. So what do we know about Gardasil? So as with all vaccines, before a vaccine can be approved for use in Canada, the drug company has to show that it's safe, it's effective, and they can produce a good quality vaccine. So Gardasil, there were over 30,000 trials, 30,000 women in about 3 or 4 trials, and it showed that it was safe. What does that mean? It showed the most common side effects were local site reaction, some swelling. Those were the most common. There were no rare or serious reactions found in any of the studies. And it also showed it was highly, highly effective. And that's where we talk about how effective are vaccines. This is one that's highly effective. It showed that they produced good immune responses that lasted sufficiently throughout the length of the study, which was up to 5 years. And they showed it was highly effective. It was 100% effective at preventing abnormal PAPs, let's say, or cervical changes. It was about 99% effective at preventing warts, and it was anywhere from 90 to 95% effective at preventing infection. So it's a highly effective vaccine. It gets something that's really important. So what have we known about Gardasil post-marketing? So almost 170 million doses have been administered worldwide. That is a lot of doses of vaccine. And basically what we're finding is very similar to what was found in the trials of 30,000 women. Most common side effect is pain and swelling at the injection site, which anyone who's had a vaccine knows that happens. And then slight increased incidence of fainting, but I think that's more not necessarily the vaccine's a problem. You're giving it to young girls who are maybe more prone to fainting. And there's been very rare anaphylactic reactions. So they estimate from one Australian study 2 per 100,000 doses. That's still very rare. The WHO considers anything less than 10,000. But post-marketing surveillance identified something that was important, and so that's part of the advice now we provide to anyone giving out the HPV vaccine in our public health unit. That's part of the consent we provide, and so providers should be prepared. There could be anaphylaxis. It's very rare, but it's something we have to be prepared for. So all these studies show it's very safe. And so what's the experts say? Because this is who should people trust? You know, the Toronto Star or the experts? Obviously, I'm biased, the experts. And I sit on this committee as a representative for the College of Family Physicians of Canada. So the National Advisory Committee on Immunization is really made up of experts in immunology, microbiology, infectious disease, public health, pediatrics, and pharmacology. So experts across the country. And there's also representatives from many different organizations that have expertise or a role within vaccines. So Public Health Agency of Canada is the one that supports this committee. Health Canada approves the vaccine and is responsible for doing the monitoring on an ongoing basis. Canadian Public Health Association, obviously leaders in public health. The CDC, we each sit on each other's committee to provide expertise, and so that we're aware of what they're doing with vaccines, they're aware of what we are. The Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada, Family Physicians, CARE is something about research, I can't remember right now. Canadian Pediatric Society, and the Association of Medical Microbiologists of Canada. So it is a committee that reviews the evidence and then makes recommendations for how should this vaccine be used in Canada. So they're the ones that decide, should it be young girls from age 9 to 26, should it be young boys, those type of things. And they look at the evidence and the safety. I currently sit actually on the HPV work group committee. So we are responsible for reviewing all the safety data and new data on an ongoing basis. So looked at, should it now be a 2-dose versus a 3-dose schedule? When the new 9 strain vaccine comes out, what would we be giving that to people? What would be our recommendations? So I can tell you it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of review that happens, and everyone on this committee is committed to making sure that whatever our recommendations are, they're evidence-based and that they're safe, and that also considers what are the resources and costs related to our recommendations. So how did this story unfold? So for those of you who read the articles or also followed the discussion after, is the article obviously was an issue, but I think there was a lot of good that came out of it because there was a lot of the discussion that happened in the news, media outlets, Washington Post, Huffington Post. They were all reporting on this. So February 11th, the editor went on As It Happens. I myself have never listened to As It Happens, but it seems like, Mark's like, really? It seems like it's something maybe I need to listen. No, we don't know. Well, it seems like it's like day-to-day stuff on CBC. So he admitted we failed. February 13th, they, from all the feedback they got, changed the title and changed some of the way the article was presented in an attempt to make it more balanced and made clear there's no scientific evidence of a dark side to this vaccine. February 13th, one of their public editors wrote an article saying, this is what we've done. We acknowledge that we gave disproportionate play to these stories, that women thought that they may have been associated with a vaccine, despite the fact that the evidence does not suggest that. And on February 20th, they removed it from their website. So you can't get it anymore on the website. And when I did this article, I had to actually ask my staff, did anyone keep this article? Because it's no longer available unless, I don't know, maybe you can get it out in print, but you cannot get it off their website because they realized that they had done damage. And this is not, they did damage, and we'll talk about, like, what damage have they done? Well, what is the harm? And some of this we've been talking about, the anti-vaccination movement. The harm is the Star is a huge newspaper, has huge readership. They presented it as an investigation. So people, it's understandable why people thought, well, maybe this is true. And they're responding to 5 horrible stories about young women. And so there were nuances that we discussed today about what does the data they presented mean. But if you don't have someone explaining that to you, and what if you don't read all the follow-up, it's hard not to remember that picture, especially the picture of the mom holding a picture of her dead daughter. And so what's the harm? The harm is people aren't going to get vaccinated against HPV. HPV is serious. It causes cancer. It causes warts. 400 women die from cervical cancer in Canada every year. And we know the vaccine presents 70% of cervical cancers and 90% of genital warts. So people are missing out on something that can be life-saving, and that's unfortunate. Interesting when you said about when you Google the internet. So I thought, I need some visuals. So I Googled Gardasil posters or HPV vaccine posters. This is what came up. And so when you look at it, like helping to destroy the lives of little girls one injection at a time. So these, they're fear-mongering. They're not about evidence, right? It's about scare, brain damage, infertility, blood clots, and cancer. And so this is what dominates the internet, and this is the harm of stories like the Toronto Star that reinforces this, because then people can quote from the Toronto Star said, these are the types of posters. These took a long time to find, let me tell you, because yes, when you you have to go like SOGC, it's whatever. But these types of posters, you can see, try and provide information while they're trying to advertise this. Get informed. So it's 2 totally different ways of presenting information. And as the public health physician that's in charge of our programs, we do struggle about how do you present this information. And we've done focus group with parents, and we've tried to do consent forms that are visual that says and what we have done, which has worked, to do visual stuff. Do a circle that's big. This side effect is pain and swelling. And to a dot that says this side effect is rare anaphylaxis. Because you have to find a way to help parents understand what is the medical evidence and what are the risks versus benefits of this vaccine. Because as you said, Mark, if you don't acknowledge there are some risks to every vaccine, then you are presenting a biased side of the vaccine story too. So we have tried to do that and talk about the risk of anaphylaxis as a dot, but the risk of swelling at the injection site is a big, large circle. So that's it for my presentation. I think I went a bit over, but let me tell you, it's hard to do a presentation in 15 minutes. So I'm happy to have questions.